start close to on time. I know there's a 15-minute session after this, so I want to make sure everyone can get up there to the 15-minute block. So I'm Warren Wiechmann. I'm one of Chris Fox's former fellows, and finished his ultrasound fellowship, in 2010. And now I'm over here in the medical school as the Associate Dean of Instructional Technologies. And Chris wanted me to kind of talk about this whole idea of innovation a little bit, more so in the broader context of how what we're planning to do with ultrasound as far as within the medical curriculum, how that has a larger impact, or how that's sort of a good prognostic marker for where healthcare is going, and how to look at these other outside or external factors for innovation, and how those can sort of play into sort of building a stronger case for what we're doing in medical education with ultrasound. So in medical education, innovation, I think, it's talked about a lot. The term is thrown around rather loosely as far as innovation and innovator. And in medical education, primarily it comes from a couple different things, right? You can have innovation kind of a very simple formula. You have a very stable teaching environment, which a large proportion of our medical schools has. You throw in some new ideas and some new technology, and bam, just like that, you have innovation. And that's pretty much the simplest part of the way to describe how a lot of this is viewed. And if you think about it kind of on a broader context, a lot of the things that we're doing as far as bringing more clinical into the basic sciences is not groundbreaking, but it is considered innovative. And so I sort of want to couch the term innovation with a grain of salt, because it's not building something from scratch necessarily. It's just sort of rethinking an old way that isn't so effective. So that being said, a little bit of my background and why Chris and I kind of wanted to talk about this topic. So at UCI, we've done a couple of these things over the past, 4 or 5 years now. We launched an iPad-based curriculum in 2010, which is still up and running, and kind of moved our whole school into a digital learning environment. Chris, with his comprehensive curriculum, has sort of been one of the cornerstones of what we talk about here. We also have high-fidelity simulation, which is also very interesting as well, but not as sort of impressive and integrated as Chris's curriculum is here. And then we've done other things with projects like Google Glass for assessments, both in undergrad and graduate medical education. So we sort of have a good track record here at UCI of trying to stay kind of one step ahead, or at least up to speed with how a lot of these innovations are coming. And so when we think about kind of what makes these things actually happen, we can kind of look along a timeline, and we can spend a lot of time today talking about lessons learned and things that were important to get us to where we were as far as innovation, and some of the things you don't typically think about when you're sort of in your medical education bubble, and some of the questions about value and people. Frequently, even now, after having 5 years of all these projects, we still have senior level leadership that says, well, why don't we just fix that problem by buying a bunch of new stuff? And that's like one half of the equation, but oftentimes, even if you buy a bunch of new stuff, you need the people to run it. And very rarely in budget discussions, there's always sort of the line item for the one-time expense of hardware and equipment, but there's very rarely ever a line item for the faculty and personnel support that go along with it. And that's sort of a huge piece that you can't underscore, and it's very easy to think that, well, I'll just add that onto my plate right now as long as we get the equipment, which is harder to do, but the biggest piece is that longer-term commitment. Creating champions, we all sort of know about that from the students, having them sort of be the guerrilla warfare tactic to get the students on board and sort of push that part through all the way up to having faculty champions, and really giving the students that sense of ownership for the curriculum is the best way to do it. One of the things that's been most successful for us here is really identifying the non-medical education stakeholders. So what I'm talking about are the CIO, the CMIO, the chief safety officer for the hospital, all these people that you could have a very good dialogue that's outside of the curriculum, saying, we're going to create 400 students that have a skill set that a lot of your physicians don't have. And so how can you leverage that in the institution? How can you make patient safety a bigger picture? How can you talk about the IT infrastructure and getting them on board? And they aren't your usual players in these kind of discussions at cabinet meetings and leadership curriculum meetings, but these are the people that can give a nice sort of external validation to really bring that home. One of the things that we sort of just struggled with recently is trying to leverage our ultrasound training with our chief strategy officer for the hospital. Many of your institutions are probably acquiring smaller startup clinics in other areas and looking at expansion that way. So one of our discussion points that we thought to bring up is use ultrasound as a selling point for the community physicians, right? If you can leverage your faculties, the same infrastructure that you build for your students or you're going to build for your students, and the same faculty development the trainer programs that you have for your faculty could work the same way of pulling in community physicians. So if you think about, come join UCI Health, because when you become part of our faculty, you'll get extensive ultrasound training. So now you and your clinic could also do bedside screenings, AAAs, et cetera, looking for all these different things that creates sort of a value added for the community. So trying to align those ideas with the chief strategy officers are also interesting ways to look at it, because it sort of pulls in more institution-wide support for your activities. I think that's sort of an interesting approach that we've taken here that's pretty replicable. So before we kind of go even further down this rabbit hole, I think it's really important as we talk about innovation to take that big step back, or take kind of 2 steps back, and to really look at more of sort of before you even come up to any of these sort of lessons learned, before you even talk about implementation. Let's really talk about this whole idea of why are we doing this? Kind of why is this important, and why in the bigger picture of healthcare does this make a difference? And so some of these questions we talk about are these innovations as far as bringing ultrasound into the curriculum. Why is that important at all? And then why does it matter in the larger context of healthcare? And so for me, a lot of my work is really in this latter point here of looking at sort of future trends in healthcare and what's out there, what new technologies exist, and how to leverage those, and what this means for the bigger picture of things. And so when we talk about, a very obvious statement, right? Medicine's changing. This is something that's very easy for us to think about, but a lot of times people don't make the jump to think, well, if medicine's changing, therefore medical education must change. And so a lot of our schools, definitely no one in this room, not even us, of course, graduate our students at sort of like a 1980s level as far as technology, what they're comfortable with. Up until about 4 or 5 years ago, our students still did paper notes. Everything was analog. A lot of the practices were sort of done in a paper format. And so, they're graduated medical school in 2009, but they've never touched an EMR. And so it's sort of this weird dichotomy that you can have a cutting-edge medical school that has things like Da Vinci robots, but yet our students are still practicing the same way you graduated yourself 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so that's kind of the big problem with medical education, and you can see where that's going to start creating problems in the bigger picture of things. And so when you look at sort of this graph of innovation over time, you think about consumer technology naturally being sort of the leader out there, with healthcare kind of creeping at a pretty good difference below that, and education even lower than that. And so you think about this whole almost kind of this dynamic tension that's going to be happening, right? You have consumer technology that's out there, and then you have sort of healthcare technology, which is several tiers below that. And so it's very easy to think that your patients, our sort of future population that we're going to be taking care of, is going to be a lot more savvier than your students or your faculty or your residents will be when it comes to technology. So what does that really mean for us, when we're talking about ultrasound? Well, ultrasound is kind of this bigger piece that fits into this puzzle, right? And so there's 2 great kind of concepts put together, both by Eric Topol, kind of talking about this whole idea of creative destruction of medicine, highlighting this kind of dynamic tension between consumer technology and just the overall democratization of medical information to where we are right now. And the whole idea of physicians knowing everything that's sort of best for healthcare, or the very patriarchal medical society, is kind of going away, because patients have almost the same exact access to information as you do. And in many cases, with some of the new wearables and things that we'll talk about out there, they have the same diagnostic capabilities as we do in clinics and ICUs. And so when you start thinking about how that's going to create a tension, it's very obvious. And it's sort of leading to this whole rise of empowered patients that have knowledge and access, and it's not the same patients we had sort of in the Norman Rockwellian days of medicine. And so, kind of some stats to sort of bring that home. As a whole, 80-90% of the population goes online to look up stuff about their health, with about 35% of them actually going to find out specific diagnoses. And this creates sort of a problem, because we don't really know how to handle it. Half the time, patients feel comfortable talking to us about their needs. About 40% of the time, they don't even talk to us at all, based on what they find. And so you can kind of see that already in these very early stages of just information gathering, patients are cutting us out of the bigger picture of healthcare, which is kind of scary and concerning, especially since we're so worried about reimbursement and all those other pieces. Maybe even the scariest piece, the large majority of the time, when they're looking up this information, they're going to Google, right? And it's not just our patients. There's a study out there that has Wikipedia as being, I think, the second highest medical resource used by physicians and residents. And so it's not just our patients that are to blame, it's sort of us. But what makes us different than our patients, right? We have the background knowledge to know that something on Wikipedia might be good or bad, whereas they don't. Other sites like health information sites like WebMD and Medscape are down here in the 10% range. But you can kind of see how, because of all this technology and this future of healthcare, where this is all going, it's really kind of shifting sort of our role as a centerpiece for healthcare, like it used to be, kind of out to the fringes. And so when we start talking about ultrasound and other pieces of why we're doing this in the curriculum, hopefully it's starting to paint this picture of why this is going to be a problem for us. And even Google's kind of tackling this too, so that the next time you go online and search, they've started testing out this feature. If you search for things like knee pain, it'll give you a prompt like this that says, based on your query, we understand you're trying to understand a medical condition. Pretty much insert your credit card here, and we'll bring in a telemedicine doc to solve your needs. Which is interesting, and they've tried this in certain markets and has been very successful. So if you think about, again, we're trying to practice, or we're trying to train people for this future of healthcare. We're training people for what we think healthcare is going to be, and what patients expect is going to be completely different, right? The Jetsons kind of nailed it, way back in the day. That is what our patients want. I'm still waiting for my jetpack and hover skateboard from Back to the Future, but patients kind of expect this to happen. You call your doctor, and you see your doctor, and they see you, and that's it. You don't have to wait 2 hours in clinic or call back and fill out your same HIPAA release forms over and over again when you go to the doctor. So, this is sort of the expectation that's out there for healthcare. And the sad part is that, this is sort of what we deliver back to them. There's complaints that we're not tech savvy, that we're sort of getting sidelined and pushed to the side here. So you can see already that, from our perspective, we have cool things. We have like robots and other like nanomedicine and all these cool things, but for the average person that's going to interact with the physician, they don't see it. And so it creates this big sort of problem here. And a lot of it comes to the fact that when we start talking about, again, what patients have access to, all these things here, scale, blood pressure cuff, blood glucose, right? This is kind of what you can do in clinic, right? Think about any outpatient clinic. You can now go to Target or Walgreens and buy the equivalent diagnostic capabilities of an outpatient clinic, which is kind of interesting, and all for maybe about $400. Kind of the bigger portion of that is, you think, there's no ophthalmoscope, there's no otoscope, but actually they have both those things now. Those are each about $120 that have attachments for your phone that now give you almost probably unmatched ability to be the same as an outpatient clinic. And so these are sold not to physicians, they're sold to patients. Physicians can buy them. But if you think about it now, this whole thing of primary care that we're looking at and trying to prepare a lot of our students for, it's very different now. Well, you think, at least they don't have EKGs, right? But they do have EKGs. Sure, it's a single lead. This one's actually FDA approved. It's the Alivecor EKG case, but it's FDA approved for AFib, and it's got all this smart logic, which we'll kind of talk about in a second, that's built into that, right? So again, all these things are being miniaturized and sent to our patients, and patients are coming in and using these and expecting them. Kind of the next step up is this product. It's called Scanadu. And it can actually give full ICU level vital signs. And it's about yay big. And it's Bluetooth powered and fits in your phone. It's still going through FDA approval right now, and it sells for, I think, $129. So again, it really kind of changes the whole context of this mobile ICU and all these different environments. And so, the next sort of step up from that is they have a smartphone case that incorporates that into your phone. And this one, if you're an asthmatic, is great because it has a built-in FVC spirometer in there that does trends or reports vital capacity. So you can kind of see where a lot of this is kind of going to, that we have all these kind of cool technologies out there that are not really being pushed to medical education. It's not being pushed towards the medical community. And it sort of comes back to this bigger question of, a lot of our students know nothing about this, but these are already on the market. And this is going to be, 5 or 10 years from now, this will be the norm for a lot of what patients are getting their basic kind of surveillance medical care from. And we in medical education are not really addressing this at all. And so again, just sort of that split of what patients expect versus what we can provide. We all know about 3D printing, or have heard about 3D printing at least. Ranges from organs to food to guns in some cases. But this is sort of a collaboration between a company called MakerBot and this group called Robohand. And this is for little kids that have prosthetic needs, right? So every year they grow, and instead of having a $15,000 prosthetic, they get the blueprints. A local school can print out a prosthetic limb for about $70. And so it's really changing the way that, again, consumer-based products are being leveraged for healthcare uses in these environments. And so these is kind of the whole global change that's happening in healthcare, that it's not just healthcare innovators changing the way that healthcare is being practiced. Kind of the future of healthcare is coming from these small startups that are out there. And MakerBot's one of many different companies that does this, but there's tons of them out there. And you can just imagine the potential for anything. Now I've seen they take 3D reconstructions of CT scans for, say, little kids that have tracheal malformations and print out a new trachea every year, and then kind of always implant that and do that. I've seen implantable 3D hips, all these other pieces that come together from collaborations with radiology. And so sort of thinking about all these ways that these things can collaborate. And then, of course, finally, we've all seen these devices before. There's probably a lot more here that we've all signed NDAs that we can't talk about. We've seen from companies, right? But you can imagine, right? So this is where things are going. So kind of all these other slides were sort of a lead up to kind of talk about, well, what about ultrasound? How does this fit into the whole equation, right? So we've seen every other field, kind of every other little segment of medicine get completely disrupted by consumer technology. So, everything's becoming portable. I mean, there's no iPhone or Android on there yet. But you can just imagine one of these days they're going to have something that plugs right in. Well, actually that happened. So at South by Southwest, Philips kind of really highlighted their app-based ultrasound device there where the transducer plugs right into an Android tablet. And the interesting part about this is their big release for this was not at AMA, was not at a large ultrasound conference, was not at a medical convention, it was at South by Southwest, which is sort of like the hipster, the coolest place to go for innovative products. Probably the physician population at South by Southwest is like 10% of the user groups, 10% of the participants there. The other 90% are patients, startup investors, non-medical people. So for us, this is huge, right? You can imagine now that schools are having tablets. Now you can just buy transducers. You might have to buy more of them because you can imagine these transducers getting lost. But imagine if this became kind of the norm, right? That would change a lot of how we could teach ultrasound if every student had a white coat in one pocket, a tablet in one pocket and a transducer in the other they can swap out and check in and check out. And so this is big business for us as far as changing how we could teach, and it wasn't brought up anywhere in a healthcare setting. It was brought up at South by Southwest. And so the next thing I want you to think about is, so take a device like this, which has just kind of come to market in the past year or so, and it's still in its early phases. I'm sure I haven't had a chance to play with this. I don't know if anyone has, or if you're allowed to talk about it. Think about what happens when you start applying what Alivecor does. So going back to the Alivecor discussion with the EKG case, right? You'd think to yourself, well, one lead EKG seems kind of useless, right? But if you're someone who has chronic AFib or blocks or other problems that are as far as conduction or rhythm abnormalities, this is great. The days of wearing a Holter are long gone because now you can reach into your pocket when you have palpitations and pull out your device and track your EKG. So what Alivecor offers right now is that when you capture your EKG, you can send it up to the cloud for analysis. So the same way that you have the automated system on most of your EKG machines, Alivecor does that. So you pay per EKG, $2 for an EKG to get read by a technician. So it gets pushed up to the cloud. Within 15 minutes, a tech reads back kind of the top header on a normal EKG saying sinus or AFib or concerning. You can see on the far left there, it says possible AFib detected, and the fine print, which it's kind of hard to see, it says we recommend further analysis or talking to your medical professional. For $5, if you're willing to spend the money, a cardiologist, a board-certified U.S. cardiologist will read your EKG for you. And so there's that kind of environment. But what they're doing by sending everything up to the cloud is every time this is done, that variant of the EKG is captured and stored in a big database, right? Everyone's heard of Watson before, the chess superstar, now going into medicine and cancer medicine and genomics. So it's kind of take this scenario again. So thinking about EKGs, now think about back to ultrasound. Right, so we have our sort of tablet-based ultrasound device, and now you're going to kick that image up to the cloud. So imagine you have that. You're going to tie that in with some big data. Maybe Watson's kind of powering this thing from the back end. But what it's doing now is it's taking your image, and it's going to compare that image to hundreds of thousands of other similar right upper quadrant scans or similar cardiac echoes, and run analytics on that, just saying, well, based on your image, there's a positive finding or a negative finding. The logic is not that far out there to be able to do this. It's already happening in dermatology, where you can snap photos of rashes. I'm an ER doc, so everything's a rash. You snap a photo of a rash, and it gives you a diagnosis, and there you go, you're done. It's happening in sort of radiology already, where they're having algorithms look through just basic radiology films, primarily in x-rays first, but the logic and the computing power is there. So it wouldn't be a far possibility to say that maybe one day, this is still required by the FDA to be sold only to physicians, maybe one day this gets sold to patients, right? And now what? So if we start thinking about this whole idea of future of healthcare, it's not that far off that, one day this will happen. It's kind of scary to think about one day this will happen, but we've seen every other aspect of medicine get disrupted this way. So even though many of us probably don't want to think it's going that direction, it probably will, and we have to deal with it, right? So, we have to think as a whole kind of what our priorities are in medical education. Histology is great, biochem is awesome, but at the same point, there's all these other big picture issues that are coming out there as far as what's the practice of medicine going to be like in 2016 or 2020. It's not going to be the same. And so, when we kind of think about these, think about your medical programs. Are we really training our students to practice as 21st century physicians, not 19th century or even 20th century physicians? And so these are kind of the bigger context issues that we have to deal with. And one of the ways I think that we can start there is by, we're doing this already with ultrasound. Ultrasound's getting into the curriculum. So you're exposing them to a technology, which is great. A technology which, even in the house of medicine, is still young, cutting edge, and cool for the most part. It crosses specialties, and it really gets our students to really think about those core ideas of multi-specialty approach. And you can have ultrasound in anatomy, you can have ultrasound in physiology and pathology. We've seen ultrasound cases in microbiology show up, and you can cover the whole spectrum of UME to GME. But what that does now is every student that graduates from a program that has an ultrasound curriculum is now that much more, at least tech savvy, to understand how their machine works. We all sort of teach not to one machine, but to the basic concept of how the technology works. They'll understand workflows, they'll understand all these bigger pictures of what makes an ultrasound work that'll get them a little bit better prepared for what this whole future of healthcare is like. So it's sort of a roundabout way of getting them ready for this whole new change in healthcare. And I think we're off to a good start by doing it, but we felt it was kind of important to kind of paint this bigger picture of where things are going and the possibility of ultrasound being kind of adapted by the mass public. And then what do? Then at that point, it's going to be required that every school teach ultrasound, because now our patients are expecting it. So everyone here already is on the cutting edge of that and one step ahead, but the possibilities are sort of there that this is actually a viable future. So I just want to kind of put that out there for everyone to think about. And with that, I just want to kind of open it up to any questions or discussion points.
That was a great talk, Warren. I've not been exposed to some of those products. It's just great to see what's out there.
Cool.
My question is, are there any physicians that are doing research on these studies, like for management of acute and chronic illnesses like AFib or heart failure?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the technology, like kind of this emerging technology, is probably where I guess the best equivalent point-of-care ultrasound was 5 or 6 years ago. Very early, starting to build a lot of careers and people just trying to find a niche, and also having the same problems of being sort of a new area of research, that there's not a lot of precedent for, how can a mobile device manage your health? And so imagine submitting that AFib study from an app to Journal of Cardiology, or any Journal of Cardiology. It's sort of viewed down upon as far as not having a lot of relevance, even though patient-wide is already building that. So the research is a little slim in these areas. but there's a lot of people trying to push through there. And there's actually a couple new journals that are arising because of that. There's one called the Journal of Medical Internet Research, which has kind of become like a safe harbor for all these kind of technology or app-based research studies. And there's a lot of cool things in there. Cool. Great question.
I can imagine part of your job is the technology innovator dean is to get buy-in from faculty into these new modalities.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of pearls of wisdom do you have
Sure.
for other people wanting to get their faculty on board with some of these new
Right.
modalities in their institutions? Not just ultrasound, obviously,
Right.
but other modalities.
Right, it's a great question because the perception of my job is true. I play with a lot of toys, and it's fun because all the stuff that kind of looks new, I'm like, hey, I want to buy that and check it out. I want to do research on it, which is why I have like an Apple Watch. I'm doing research on it, but it's like those kind of things that if you take me versus say another faculty, they'll say, well, Warren's just doing his job and whatever, right? So a lot of this comes. I find it a lot easier now because a lot of these new innovative things that are coming out are aimed at patients. Whereas like on the ed tech side, the educational technology side, if we came and said, well, there's a new way we can do flipped classroom, it would take a lot more buy-in because it's like, well, yeah, that's great for teaching, but what's the bigger impact? I don't know. They might do better on their grades, on their standardized test or step one, right? But if you have like an AFib device or a clinical device, and say patients are using this, they're already testing it out there, they want access to it, you can really kind of build that narrative of patient engagement, patient safety, and sort of that's the next progression. So a lot of our discussions now about the technologies we're looking at really evolve around kind of the patient, they become very patient focused. So even the Apple Watch, we have a rad-onc resident that wants to use the heart rate feature in an Apple Watch to create an objective measure for pain in cancer patients. So he wants a little bit of funding from the hospital to buy 10 of them to give to cancer patients and use HealthKit to build out studies to see if they have better ways to track acute pain and get ahead of the pain curve instead of behind it. And so for that, yes, he's also someone that wants a watch, but at the same point, he's coming up with a product or a project that potentially could have impact directly for patient benefit. So I think there's a lot of these kind of ideas that are coming out that are a lot easier to spin than, well, I want to watch because I can now text him from my wrist, which is not going to sell very easily. Yeah. Great.
Outstanding lecture. I think this is very much the future of medicine, and I think jumping on these things early and establishing it in our curriculum and med school and residency, I think is really going to make the difference. And we look at now having EMRs, for example, and then we look at people doing paper and pen.
Right.
You look at them like they're crazy. And one day we're going to look back,
Right.
when we're walking with our iPhones and everyone's real-time live vitals are on there.
Right.
You're going to look back and say, well, I could have looked in the chart and seen their vitals from 2 hours ago,
Right.
and say that's crazy.
Right.
So this is like just cutting edge stuff.
Right, and the EMR example this is the interesting part, I think, when we talk about ultrasound, because when we think about technology in medical education, the first thing that pops to mind is the EMR, and everyone like groans and rolls their eyes because every EMR is terrible. Everyone else's is better than yours, right? No matter what, Epicso is going to be better than Allscripts unless you have Epic, and you're like, Allscripts is probably better. So no matter what, no one's really happy with their EMR. And so when you start talking about that in the curriculum, everyone kind of groans like, I hate using it clinically, I'm going to hate using it to teach students, right? But ultrasound is kind of that different piece where a lot of us are sort of sono evangelists, and we love this idea of ultrasound and performing scans and being at the bedside, and all these different pieces I think sell very easy in a curriculum. So when we talk about things like students don't get enough time at the bedside, the whole physician-patient relationship is being destroyed, if you require a student to be at the bedside for another 5 or 10 minutes acquiring an image and actually touching a patient, that's huge. And so these other pieces that don't really fall into a nice easy cubby of, well, it's a good ROI here, there's a good investment here, but you're saying I'm creating more opportunities for students to get back to the bedside, that sells much better than say, hey, let's teach them how to put orders into the EMR so when they become third years, they're really good at it. That doesn't have a bigger impact instead of I'm teaching them to kind of refocus their vision back on the patient instead of clicking off orders. So, great. Dave.
More of a technical question.
Yeah.
More goals, the shrinking of these capacitors in half every 18 months. And I heard that was running out here in 2015, 2018, because they said the transistors can't get any closer
Right.
physically. And then they're thinking about things like qubits and so forth. What's
Right.
on the horizon we've gotten used to each couple of years, we
Right.
get a new iPhone that has more power
Right.
to it, or a new ultrasound device. What's on the future as far as, capacitor
Right.
and transistor technology?
No, great question. I think a lot of it comes back to, I mean, yeah, there is sort of the possible end to Moore's Law, but we're starting to see almost the converse, because now the cloud is really sort of taking over and leveraging. So if you have small devices that are completely maxed out, but now you have 1 million of them together, then you have this sort of that combined computing power, which I think is the really interesting part of kind of Watson and all the big data stuff that's being put out there, because now you're not just dealing with one data set, you're dealing with all these millions of data sets and points that can now individually have good power, but combined. I think that's kind of the more interesting piece that I'm really interested to see, with Apple and IBM partnering and all these other IBM partnerships with Watson, what they're going to do with all the healthcare centers. So, cool. Great questions. Yeah.
We're also probably see us a bit more in the quantum computing area, and possibly
Yeah.
also in DNA computing.
Mm-hmm.
Because DNA computing, because we only deal with zeros and ones, but DNA computing is actually going to give you 4.
Right.
So you got quite a bit more computing power out there.
Right. No, I mean, those things are really cool too. In those areas, I mean, I tried putting together a slide deck for another talk on DNA computing, and from 2 weeks ago, it's already outdated. So it's a very emerging kind of new field that's really hard to keep track of. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of potential there that we haven't explored in yet too.
It's just a matter of being able to capture what you want to have and being able to make that computer
Right.
system work.
Right. Well, I think a lot of it too is just whatever the new technology is, just having an awareness that it exists is, I think, a huge step in most medical schools, because there's not a lot of leadership or even students that realize a lot of these things are out there. I think that's the first big barrier, realizing that patients are actually using this stuff, and there's pockets of kind of innovation, of course, like in LA, New York, kind of Bay Area, even San Diego. There's kind of these hot spots where a lot of patient populations are using this, but it's going to spread slowly, and it'll become more commonplace and more mainstream. But just having that awareness that it exists is important. So.
What's the regulatory framework for this? Like, how does it go from device to a product that's FDA approved? Do you think that's adequate? Any challenges, like any lawsuits coming on?
Super outdated. The regulatory piece is very outdated and almost interfering with a lot of the innovation that happens. That's why you see a lot of these products, not because they dislike physicians, they just don't want to go through the FDA approval process. So if you can get the same, at least matching diagnostic accuracy, but it's not FDA approved, so they can't make decisions or medical judgments, but then they can say, well, I can give you all your data on your vitals, and then it's up to you to then kind of leverage that piece. And so that's why it's kind of diverging. Whereas it would be great if those companies could say, well, I'm going to partner up with healthcare institutions or even physicians and say, let's really solve the solution. There's only a couple of them that are FDA approved, Alivecor and a few other devices. But the timelines for a lot of those is still 5 to 6 years. And in 5 to 6 years, there's tons of new competitors already. And so it's hard, because now you're going to have this split of consumer-only devices that have the same ability as medical devices, but you don't know what to do. So for the Alivecor piece, it had the same exact software, but before it was FDA approved, which was, I think, 2.5 years ago, it was called Alivecor Vet. And so it was used in the vet industry. Nothing different about it. Same thing, just had a V at the end of the name. When it got FDA approved, they just changed the logo. That's it. And so patients could buy it without, you don't need a license to buy it as a vet. So they would buy it and use it on their own, even though it wasn't approved, just to get that tracking. And then officially at that point, they could buy it when it was FDA approved. So there's going to be all these kind of weird workarounds, which is not really good for the overall picture. But
One very interesting, but your stuff about direct to consumer, or the consumer's ability to have this information. I think many of us have already experienced where patients have access to their full laboratory status, and they'll have a totally normal CBC, except their mean corpuscular volume will be will have a little star next to it because it's out of range, and they'll call you up because, my God, what does this mean? So what's the education process along the way? Because this can really get out of control.
right. And that's, I think, the perfect question to ask, right? Because there is no education process to this. There's even no education process to teaching the patients about their lab tests. And that's, old, as far as technology is concerned, that's old technology. Even giving them a copy of their H&P. And and saying, well, these are the abbreviations we use. You hear all those things on the web about, oh, they call me an SOB and all this other stuff. That's still, as much as those are kind of like old wives' tales for medical documentation, it's still true because we as healthcare people don't teach our patients how to manage their own health, and that's the core fundamental problem. And so, ultrasound is like 30 steps down the line. We still can't teach them how to read their own CBC or what to do with it. Or teach your students how to tell them, okay, here's a copy of your CBC. Trust me, it's all normal. You don't have to worry about this one and this one and this one. But I think that's a part that by putting ultrasound into a curriculum, that has to be, in addition just to image acquisition and kind of doing the actual hands-on and learning the images, there should be sort of a bigger context of what does this mean. If a patient can have this when you're sitting at the bedside, don't furrow your brow and say, ooh, don't do that. But how do you easily tell them that I see something here that's concerning, I'm a first-year medical student, I don't really know what I'm looking at, let me go find someone. How do you do that eloquently without scaring the life out of someone? Like those kind of context issues, I think, are things that we need to tackle in medical education that should come in very early. So if you start as a first year, by the time they're fourth year, they've got 4 years of kicking the tires and they should be much better at it. But you're absolutely right. Whenever I bring this talk up and I say, direct-to-consumer ultrasound, I'm looking usually for a couple of people in the audience to say, kind of putting their head down because it's scary.
Well, and that's a good segue into my other concern or question, which has to do, and I think it was mentioned upstairs before, the concept of artificial intelligence or big data.
Right.
You have thousands of scans that are read into the ability now for artificial intelligence to now read the scan for you.
Right.
But I don't know that the people who are trying to do that appreciate how operator dependent ultrasound is.
Right.
And difficult to standardize.
Right.
And patients certainly don't understand
Right.
it. They'll come in and say, I had a sonogram as if they had a CBC.
Right.
You got a well-calibrated Coulter counter. You're going to have the same crit in my hospital as your
Right.
hospital.
Right.
But having an ultrasound is very operator dependent, and at least in my field, and it's probably true in most of yours, people don't realize that anatomy changes from hour to hour. You have a big bowel movement, your uterus goes from anteverted to axial. And yesterday I could see the endometrial echo, and today I can't.
Right.
I'm the same patient,
Right.
with the same equipment.
Right.
And so I'm not sure how this is going to feed into artificial intelligence.
Right. It's an interesting piece because we're one of the companies that we've been just following along closely. For them, it's much easier in kind of more traditional radio,
Well, so
X-ray,
it's
CT,
CT or MR
and that
because
sort
of the
easy piece.
standardization of
Right.
image planes.
Right. But it's very hard to, especially in this where it is software dependent. And if you're potentially thinking of having a patient be an operator, how do you tell them, where's the indicator and where do I put that on myself? That's going to really change things too. But you're right. There's this other kind of, even with ultrasound, there's a hidden curriculum or hidden level of expertise that has to happen in order to have the scan perform properly before you can even apply all this logic to it. But you hit on a couple of really great points that we tackle or have to kind of deal with a lot. It's that whole issue of, what about the patients? Because we focus so much on teaching faculty and students, we rarely involve the patient in that discussion, and that's going to have to change.
Well, I would offer a comment, which is, like so many things in medicine, it can work very well as long as you know what the limitations are. So I will give you an example. In 1986, a thing called the Holler-Gottesfeld Foundation. Chuck Holler was one of the pioneers of obstetrical ultrasound. Ken Gottesfeld died tragically in a skiing accident in 1984. Chuck Holler died the year after. Many of us in OB/GYN ultrasound, because we've been around a lot longer than almost anybody in this room, started a foundation in their honor. Well, they had a think tank, and I don't know, is it called Lake Arrowwood or Arrowhead? It's not far from here.
Right.
There's a conference center. They had 50 sort of luminaries in ultrasound get together in 1986. And I made the comment, embarrassed to say this, that someday a woman would have a personal probe that would go into her vagina and she'd plug it into a modem. To give you an idea, there was no internet yet, there was modems, right? And I'm gonna tell her on the phone, turn it right, turn it left, because patients would come to me who had a positive pregnancy test and they were bleeding. I would put a transducer into the vagina and I would see cardiac activity in basically 4 seconds. And they'd say, it's such a shame you had to fight traffic, come here, park your car, come upstairs, that you couldn't hold the phone between your legs and I could, make this diagnosis. But I don't mean to be facetious, but I guess what I'm implying is this personal probe or the consumer
Right.
If there's an embryo with a heartbeat,
Right.
that's gonna be easy.
Right.
And if you have a positive
Right.
like that,
Right.
positive meaning a good result,
Right.
then this cloud or whatever can be
Right.
helpful.
Right.
It's when it's not diagnostic.
Right.
That's when you have to know to say, now you have to go to Plan B, which is, yes, you do have to go to see Goldstein at NYU because we don't have the answer.
Right.
And I think the problem in medicine is people feel the moment they start to do something, they've got to come up with the answer. And the mark of a good physician has always been knowing when to ask for help. So even when it's artificial intelligence, you know, if 60% of the time that gives you a sufficient answer, that'll be great, as long as it realizes that 40%, wherever that number is, it's got to kick it back to Plan B.
Right.
And that's got to be built into the system.
Right.
From guys like you.
No, I mean, it's a great point because it's not a new concept and it's not a new problem, but in the 30 years since then, almost 30 years, our kind of culture hasn't changed necessarily where we know how to deal with those managing expectations. And so I think the hard part about technology, I mean, it's easy to come here and show a bunch of cool toys, which is the fun part of the job. The hard part is how do you change how we all view it, how this works, which is hopefully going to change in my career span, but it may not because it hasn't changed for hundreds of years for medicine. And so now it's, you know, it's these outside forces that are pushing us to make this change, and we don't know what's going to happen, but it's a great point. Yeah. Awesome discussion, yeah.
Edward Roberts talked about that diffusion of innovation and talked about that there's innovators, early adopters, low majority, laggards.
Right.
And I know it's with ultrasound, but for institutionally for all technology, how do you go from that early adopters, there's pockets of people that are doing some of these devices,
Right.
and they could probably be useful to a lot more clinicians across the campus. But then how do you link them and turn that early adopters into the early majority and get over that tipping point? Because there's different technology, different people, we see that at Ohio State, that are using, but maybe you're not aware of it.
Right, and it's tough. I mean, we've done glass for almost a year and a half now, and we still have poor penetration in surgery, which we thought was going to be our big pull for it. But a lot of the problem is just the camera angle and battery life, and so when you're scrubbed into a 6-hour case and it dies after 40 minutes, you're stuck wearing a useless piece of technology. Our biggest surprises were dermatology loves it. Every day they're sending me photos like, hey, look at this thing we found, here's a video, love it. And the PICU loves it, mainly for teaching and showing residents and creating videos. And so it's sort of realizing I had very low expectations coming into it, but just trying to figure out where I had all my attention put on surgery, and I didn't really focus on anyone else until that hopped in. And so for us, our approach now, we've sort of taken for the next phase of it is leading a unit with every department and finding one person that, usually it's a resident that picks it up, and that we give them 2 months, they come back, and if they have nothing useful, we kind of take it to another department and go from there. But that's how we find these little pockets of innovation, hope that it spreads at least within their department. And I think that Chris has done a lot of that with ultrasound, but we still have departments that, you know, are very tough to get buy-in from, even if their kind of neighboring department is doing it. So it's tough. Yeah. Great. Thank you, everyone. This is great.